The devastating successes of the Axis forces in the first couple of years of World War II helps to create a rather strange alliance. Three unified nations who otherwise have very, very different agendas. As portrayed in the photo here, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union is the leader of the world's largest communist nation. Franklin D. Roosevelt is President of the United States and therefore the head of a government that is the largest capitalistic democratic nation on the planet. And finally, Winston Churchill, who as the head of the government of the British Empire is a constitutional monarchy, an imperialistic, capitalistic nation. These three aren't necessarily the best of friends in peacetime. But because the threat is so big, especially the threat of Adolf Hitler and Nazi fascism, these three normally rivals will gather together to become the Grand Alliance, or more euphemistically, the Big Three. And they will confront then this Axis aggression. It's increasingly important to bring the resource strength of these nations together. The Soviet Union is heavily embattled with the forces of the Nazi army. The best and the most of the Soviet Union is trying to knock out the last of Soviet resistance. The Germans are going after Leningrad in the north, going after Moscow in the central Russian area, and in the south after Stalingrad and the resources, especially the oil of that area. And Stalin is put to it. The British and the Americans know that they need to get back into the war. They need to get feet on the ground as quickly as possible. And so second fronts become the critical issue. Get troops back on the Western Front of the war, get them into France, get them into Central Europe, get them into a place where they can relieve some of the pressure on the Soviets, and in a massive pincers effort, confront the German and Italian fascism of Europe. Now, at the same time, and this is primarily an American thing, though the British will contribute eventually, the United States is caught up with a war in the Pacific. And as the Soviets are holding out against the Nazis in Eastern Europe, the Americans are fighting a desperation, at a distance, holdout action against the Japanese. The American victory in the Battle of Midway is a surprise and a result of technological advances. The Americans are advanced in code breaking and an overconfidence by the Japanese. It's a turning point in the war. It means the Japanese won't be able to be the aggressors anymore and will have to react to American adventurism and reconquest. But it's not an ending. The United States is having to divide its resources between two theaters of the war. The Pacific will always get less than the European theater, but this, in a real sense, is a global conflict. And the Allies are having to fight all around the world. The second fronts take multiple different forms. In 1942, the Americans and the British land troops in North Africa. This doesn't satisfy the need to relieve a lot of the pressure off of the Soviet Union, but their eventually successful campaign across North Africa will secure the Suez Canal, will make sure that the British maintain their important lifeline to their imperial possessions, and importantly will give a lot of practice to amphibious landings. A lot of hard lessons are learned in this lower stakes theater. So the Americans and the British and the other allies are getting trained in amphibious warfare, which is going to become increasingly important. In 1943, the new second front is in Italy. Again, this one doesn't relieve pressure from the Soviets the way that the Allies had hoped, but a lot of important lessons are learned, and one of the members of the Tripartite Pact is going to be knocked out of the war. The Italians are going to collapse and surrender. The real second front, though, comes in June of 1944, what's known as the D-Day landings. But basically, massive American, British, and other allies, the French, the Poles, forces from the Low Countries, imperial forces, will land on the beaches of Normandy in France. and will immediately begin to pour massive numbers of troops and materiel into a broadening front. The inability of the Nazi forces to throw this invasion back means that they will now be facing the resource might of both the Soviet Union on the east and the combined Allied powers on the west, a two-front disaster that Adolf Hitler had hoped to avoid. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Americans have begun to advance back against the Japanese Empire. Late campaigns in 1942 in New Guinea and in the Solomon Islands have led to a new strategy known as island hopping. Rather than attempting to capture every single Japanese base in the Pacific, the Allies will designate the strategic ones and will move quickly across to neutralize those areas that are most important to Japanese control of the Southwest and South Central Pacific region. This all then leads to 1945 and the Great Last Stands. The problem for the Axis powers always was that they just didn't have the material strength to fight a long war of attrition against the Allies. The British Empire, the two continents of North and South America, the resources of the depth of Asian Russia meant that if all of this material wealth and industrial power were brought online, the Axis would simply be overwhelmed. And in this sense, 1943 was the crucial year of the war. 1943 saw the Allies bring their material strength to bear, and by 1944 and 1945, though the remaining Axis forces, the Japanese and the Germans, will put up desperate fights, and casualty totals will mount dramatically, that resource wealth means that eventually those Axis forces are going to be worn down. If the will of the Allies holds, they will do this. What we see in Europe is the Russian advance along with the Allies toward the German homelands, crossing the Rhine River, moving into eastern Germany, eventually besieging a beleaguered Berlin. In the Pacific, the island hopping campaigns eventually bring Allied forces to the very doorstep of Japan. Battles at places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa are going to mean that without these long-range carrier warfare, the Allies are going to actually be able to bring the war home to the Japanese population. By spring of 1945, the end is very near. The Russians are going to capture Berlin in an extremely expensive ground battle, fighting house-to-house style fighting, and Adolf Hitler will eventually commit suicide in a bunker beneath the Reichstag to avoid capture. Within a week, the Nazi government will surrender. The war in the Pacific will continue into the late summer of 1945 as Allied forces move closer and invasion becomes almost inevitable. In order to try and stave off some of the Allied casualties of an invasion, a new weapon, and again here technology becomes important, is brought to bear: the atomic bomb. The Americans only have two of them, and they use them both. On August 6th and August 9th, atomic and then nuclear weapons are used over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths and even more casualties that spill out going forward from radioactive fallout, forcing the Japanese eventually to sue for an unconditional surrender. So, by the fall of 1945, the war has been won. Now, the Allies that had worked so closely together to bring this victory about have started to have their divisions. And the peace doesn't look like it's going to be quite as peaceful as everyone had hoped for. But at least for now, the Axis is defeated, official war is over, and the Allied forces, along with those elements of the defeated nations that are willing to work with toward a new international peace, can begin to try to put the pieces back together, though the costs of the war were enormous.